Hello everyone, my name is Alexander Huntley. I am the Research and Impact Manager at the Vegan Society. So as the Vegan Society's research lead, it's my job to oversee our research projects and ensure that the Vegan Society is using the most up-to-date, rigorous evidence that we have to inform our decision-making, to inform our campaigns or any other work that we're doing. So we pride ourselves on being an evidence-based charity, and so it's important for us to either carry out our own research or commission out research to support our work.
And I'm Elise Hankins. I'm a social researcher at Bryant Research. We're a research consultancy using social science, market research, policy analysis to transform the food system. And as I'm sure you can guess, we were commissioned for this project.
Okay, so today we'll be talking you through some of the key findings from our Veganism Around the World report, which was published in January. But first, a little background on the Vegan Society. I'll use this. So, the Vegan Society reached a significant milestone back in 2024. We turned 80 years old and have spent the last year celebrating that achievement. So the Vegan Society was founded in 1944 by a man named Donald Watson and 5 other non-dairy vegetarians who decided they needed a new name to describe who they are and what they represent. And after a little bit of back and forth, they settled on the word vegan. And we have been championing the vegan cause ever since. So aside from defining and coining the term vegan, we're also known for our vegan trademark, where we certify different vegan products, all around the world in different industries. We also run campaigns, engage with policymakers, we provide nutritional support, and we also do our own research, which is what I do. So, moving on, mapping the global vegan landscape. So, given the Vegan Society's recent milestone, we wanted to commission a wide-ranging research project to provide insights into veganism in different countries. We wanted to understand vegan adoption rates, cultural attitudes, and the position of the plant-based alternatives industry in different regions. This project will guide our strategic decisions, allowing us to identify areas where we can expand our influence and grow our impact through various campaigns and policy initiatives, and our trademark program as well. So we commissioned Bryant Research to conduct the study to present their findings, and they've produced this beautiful report, which we called the short report. Ironically, it's extremely long. It was massively cut back even from where it is now. But it's a colossal piece of work representing a lot of hard work from the Bryant Research team. So we'll be presenting a condensed snapshot of that report and presenting a condensed snapshot of the main findings, really. The aim of the project is to provide people with a deeper understanding of the global growth of veganism. So we're hoping that this report can be used for different people for different things. So a vegan and animal rights advocate could use this report to better understand where veganism is doing well, to gauge where the momentum is for change, to see which countries seem to be more receptive of vegan ideals and where the barriers might lie for the vegan movement and animal rights movement too. For businesses, they might use the report to see which countries are currently attracting vegan alternative companies and why, which markets might be fruitful areas for expansion, that kind of thing. And then also vegan, tourists could use the report to see which countries are particularly vegan friendly in terms of, vegan restaurants to go to and where vegans are located. So we were fairly fortunate that our report was covered fairly widely in the press, in the media. So the Vegeconomist and the Plant-Based covered our work, and even the slightly backhanded headline from the Daily Mail, the destinations to avoid if you love a steak on holiday. It was actually a pretty good article overall. It was quite informative, despite the slightly backhanded headline. So I'll hand over to Elise, who will talk you through a bit more about the methodology behind the research.
Yeah, so our methodology had three main arms. As you can see here, we had desk research, original polling of 10 particular countries that we zoomed in on, and we also had a qualitative analysis. So looking at desk research, we were looking at a litany of indicators, collecting data for every country for which data was available. So we're looking at the population of vegans, so that's like the rate of veganism and also vegetarianism. We're looking at vegan restaurants, animal product alternative companies, translations of the term vegan, animal product production, consumption, import and export rates. We're looking at search trends, as in Google search trends, and many more factors that didn't end up making it into the short report. On the original polling side, we looked at diet self-identification among these 10 countries. Let me actually list those off for you so you know what I'm talking about. The countries were Australia, Canada, Denmark, India, Japan, Kenya, Mexico, New Zealand, South Africa, and the US. So quite a wide regional spread there. So we're looking at diet self-identification first off, but then we were following that up with the food frequency questionnaire. So not just how people self-identified, but how they actually ate. We were also looking at how people understood the term vegan. So like, what does that term even mean? How far have these definitions crossed the world? And we're also looking at sentiment towards vegetarians and vegans and towards vegetarianism and veganism. Because I'm sure we would all be interested to know if people quite like veganism, but just find vegans a bit annoying. I'll let you know in a couple slides. On the qualitative analysis side, we were able to dive into many more countries than we were able to with our original polling. Our original polling, I should just note, only had about 200 respondents in each country, so 2,000 people overall. This was really just scratching the surface. We're hoping, in future research we can have much larger samples, many more countries get a full grasp. But this is the kind of, scratch the surface, see if there's anything interesting that would potentially be worth exploring in greater depth. So, qualitative analysis, we got to do a bit more. So this looked like creating individual country profiles for 21 countries of interest. We developed these with AI deep research tools, and then in collaboration with local advocates in each country to provide feedback, improve those country profiles, and finally create these infographics that are all accessible. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a QR code so you can go straight to the report and you can navigate to those individual country profiles if that's of interest. Okay, and I will leave it to Alex to talk through some of the first findings.
Great, thanks, Elise. So, global behavior shift. So we found that while veganism remains rare throughout the world, there is a general trend towards diets that exclude animal products, at least in part. So in the 10-country survey, flexitarians represented about 16 to 30% of almost every country sample. The sole exception to this rule is Japan, with just 7% flexitarian rate. Interest in animal product reduction appears quite high overall, although this has not yet translated into an embrace of 100% plant-based eating. But India might be the closest to such an embrace, with 14% of our sample reported a vegan diet, and this reflects some other polls that have been done in India as well. So I'll go through a couple of the key takeaways from this polling. Firstly, Mexico is an interesting case study, with 1% identifying as vegan, which is in contradiction to some other polls that have put the rate of veganism in Mexico as high as 9%, and 19% being vegetarian. There's been other recent polling, however, that backs up what we found from Statista that suggests it's about 2% of the population in Mexico follow a vegan diet. So it seems that previous research might have overstated the levels of veganism in Mexico. So further research is needed there. India stands out with a quarter of respondents claiming to be vegetarian and 14% identifying as vegan. So in contrast to the other countries polled, meat eaters don't make up the majority. But let's talk about India for a second. Most polling in India would suggest that the country is a vegetarian or vegan haven, with some arguing that India is the closest we have to a vegetarian nation. Yet, in reality, things are a bit more complicated. These numbers are based on the number of respondents per country that self-identify as vegan. Ultimately, we decided to report the self-identification figures because they help us compare across other polls that have also looked at self-identification. However, when we asked a food frequency question, we found that identity often did not align with practice. In all countries we polled, most people who identified as vegan than more people identified as vegan than actually followed a strict vegan diet, with India being the worst offender at this. So 14% of our sample identified as vegan, but the results from the food frequency questionnaire showed that only 1% actually follow a strict vegan diet. So what's going on? This discrepancy was driven mostly by dairy, with most self-identified vegans consuming dairy every week. And there could be a number of explanations, one being the way dietary identity intersects with cultural and social and caste politics in India, with vegetarianism and veganism to a lesser extent, being associated with higher castes, and therefore the high number of self-identified vegans and vegetarians in our polling, and likely in other polls, may be aspirational rather than factual. But another important note is that standardized survey questions developed in the West may not capture the cultural nuances of vegetarianism and veganism in India. For example, eggs are not considered to be vegetarian in India, so when respondents read our definition of vegetarian, which includes egg consumption, they may decide that vegan actually better captures their dietary practices. But one final note on India: it's a very big country. It's a country that has a lot of cultural diversity. And so, we're talking in quite general terms, and that's only ever going to get us so far. It's worth really looking down into the detail of countries like India, where things are quite complicated, because, generalizing, it's only going to take us so far. My final country I want to talk about on this is Japan. So Japan being an exception to the flexitarian trend, with just 7% of respondents reporting a flexitarian diet, and by far the largest percentage of people following a meat-eating diet. There are intersecting factors that offer some explanation to this. One being that Japan has quite a meat and fish-centric diet that has been quite politically driven, particularly after the Second World War, and that's resulted in skyrocketing, meat consumption. There are also cultural barriers, such as deeply integrated social norms and pressures to conform, as well as the widespread use of hidden non-vegan ingredients, such as fish-based dashi, which is a kind of fish stock that it's not required for it to be listed as an ingredient often. So it can be quite difficult to find something that is explicitly vegan. So it's clear that veganism faces some serious cultural headwinds in Japan. However, there are reasons to be optimistic about veganism's place in the country. The plant-based food market in Japan is projected to be worth $2.7 billion by 2033, and is also in the top 10 countries with the most vegan restaurants. So Japan is a bit of a paradox when it comes to veganism. So moving on. Sentiment and understanding. Overall, sentiment towards veganism appears mostly neutral and actually leans positive in most cases. Respondents could report their sentiment from 1, very negatively, to 7, very positively, and this radar plot presents the average positivity of sentiment towards vegetarianism, veganism, vegans, and vegetarians in the countries that we surveyed. So the outer circles represent a more favorable sentiment, and the inner representing less favorable. So as you can see, we recorded the most positive perceptions in India and the most negative in Japan. This is in line with the diets observed in each of these countries. And there also appears to be a relatively widespread understanding of the word vegan. So across every country polled, the most commonly selected answer was, well, the correct one, that vegans don't use animals for food, clothing, or any other purpose. And you can see that Australia, India, and Denmark had the highest rates of understanding. So when it comes to Australia, we estimate that about 2 to 3% of the population are vegan. Australia is generally considered quite a vegan-friendly country, with about, with Melbourne being considered, one of the world's most vegan-friendly cities. It's a country with a rapidly growing vegan food market with 300 plus plant-based meat alternatives and also cultured meat startups located in Australia. In 2024, this market was valued to be about $398.6 million. So it's no big surprise that Australia ranks quite highly here. However, there are some noteworthy inhibiting factors going on in Australia. One of them being the size of the animal agricultural industry. Valued at about $30 billion, this industry is an economic powerhouse, has significant lobbying influence and also high public trust, making change in Australia a bit challenging. But overall, the results from this are quite positive. I mean, the term vegan was created 80 years ago, and so for it to have such relatively widespread understanding across different regions of the world is great progress. All right, so if you're thinking of jetting off on holiday somewhere, you might want to pay attention, because we are having a look at some of the travel and tourism destinations and somewhere that you might find more vegan-friendly dining options around the world. So, as you can see in this graph, the United States, the UK, and Germany have the most vegan dining options. These are restaurants that offer at least one vegan meal option, vegetarian restaurants, and also vegan, fully vegan options. Looking at vegan restaurants specifically, we see that the US, Vietnam, and Germany lead the way in the total number per country. Whereas Taiwan, Portugal, and Singapore are top contenders when looking at the number of vegan restaurants per million people. So perhaps surprisingly, many countries simultaneously have a very high rate of meat consumption and a large presence of vegan restaurants. For example, Portugal has both the second greatest number of vegan restaurants per capita and also the third highest fish and seafood consumption per capita in the world. Then you've got the United States, which is the third highest consumer of beef per capita and yet has the most vegan restaurants in the world. It's a country where about 2 to 3% of the population are estimated to be vegan, largely driven by millennials and Gen Z. But while the US is considered quite vegan-friendly overall, it is the major cities that really lead the way, places like New York and LA and Portland, so there's kind of clusters of vegan-friendly places in this quite big country. But there's a lot of economic and cultural complexity around veganism's place in America. On the one hand, it has a reputation as a top vegan destination. On the other hand, it also, like Australia, has a very large agricultural sector that has immense lobbying power. So we're going to move on to discuss business.
Yeah, so we also recorded the number of animal product alternative companies per country, and here you're seeing just the direct number and not per capita, so apologies, you'll just have to believe me when I tell you about the per capita rates. In green, you can see these are plant-based companies, versus in orange, these are going to be the cultivated companies and also the blended protein companies. So these blend animal protein and plant protein in a singular product. So the Vegan Society doesn't consider, I should just note, cultivated meat to be vegan, but of course this is still of great interest to many vegans, I'm sure, in the room today. So it's important to highlight the state of it. So as you can see, the US is a clear leader in alternative protein companies. They have 538 of just plant-based alone, and this is followed by the UK at 137 and Germany with 132. So I don't think I need to highlight any more. I think the graph speaks for itself, this massive difference. Of course, this isn't per capita. When we look at per million people, you're actually going to see some smaller countries that are punching above their weight. When we look at per million people, we actually see that countries like Singapore, Israel, and the Netherlands are the top contenders. So when you're looking at these high number of APA companies, you have to consider that that doesn't necessarily translate to high consumption, right? Because maybe these alternative protein companies are focused on exports. They could just be located in a country because that country has good conditions for business. They might have a low tax rate. They might have diverse market access. They might have really great trade relations, right? But we did find some evidence that alternative protein companies, a greater number of alternative protein companies, does in fact coincide with greater consumption of these products. So this suggests that these countries are not merely great places to do business. It may actually impact people's consumption. So that's certainly the case for Germany, the UK, and the Netherlands, which are some of the highest, they have some of the highest per capita sales of plant-based meat, and they are also the top European countries for these companies. Now, this, of course, isn't always the case, and if you guys have any questions, I'm happy to dig into some cases in which high alternative protein presence doesn't necessarily translate to consumption. But next, we should turn to production, consumption, and trade, and I will do my best to not make this super dry. So, first, let's look at production. So, we investigated production, consumption, and trade dynamics, essentially to better understand how entrenched animal-based industries are within each country. So looking first at production, we can see that India, China, and the US are the top animal product producers, and this is by weight, by a wide margin. So these are all animal products kind of aggregated in this graph. And you can tell, I think, right away that dairy, which is in this light blue, dominates animal product production. If we want to put these numbers into perspective, I would invite us to look at India here, where you're looking at that really massive bar of dairy. They're actually the #1 dairy producers in the world. And how much dairy are we talking about here? Well, if we imagine that the River Thames were to dry up right now, today, India's annual dairy output could keep it flowing for over 40 days straight. So that's how much milk we're talking about here. And that might not be a surprise to everybody, just based on how massive the population is. But I was personally surprised by those numbers, so maybe it strikes you as well. So interestingly, when we're talking about dairy, India's dairy production doesn't just end at dairy, it translates into the beef sector. India is the 4th highest producer of beef. Now that might strike you as odd because India doesn't have a dedicated beef sector. So how are we making sense of that paradox? How are they such a top producer without having a beef sector? And I'm sure you can guess it goes back to dairy. So when dairy bovines are spent, or when the calves, being male, of course, are unable to contribute to the dairy industry, they're slaughtered. And I'm mostly talking about water buffalo here, because dairy cows, as might have, the pattern that I'm wearing here, they have many protections in India. They're considered sacred animals, and so most states in India have protections for them, and they cannot be slaughtered. But Water buffalo don't have these same protections, so they can be considered like dual purpose animals used for both milk and then afterwards used for their meat. But, talking about production here, production doesn't necessarily translate to consumption because, well, at least per capita consumption, because countries might just have massive populations, so the actual per capita consumption could be relatively modest. Are we just looking at population here? So now looking at animal product consumption, we see that Denmark is our #1 consumer of all animal products aggregated. And that, looks a bit different than the production rates that we were seeing in the previous slide and a half. I give you about 6 seconds for that last one, sorry again. So when we look at each product individually, I'll actually let you see the slides this time. We can essentially get a sense of where we get the most bang for our buck with individual campaigns. So let's look at egg consumption here. In the bottom right, you see that Netherlands is the top egg consumer. So if you were to do an egg reduction campaign in Netherlands, you could get more bang for your buck per capita, per person, than you would necessarily get with that same kind of targeted egg reduction campaign in Paraguay, which is the #10 consumer. Now, I'm not going to say #10 consumer is nothing. Obviously, that's still very high consumption. But you get where I'm going with this, that if you wanted to have a more targeted campaign for per capita change, you'd want to be looking at the top consumers. And finally, let's look at trade. So we're going to turn to import and export because knowing who the highest importers and exporters are can help us plan more strategic policy initiatives. So specifically, we can break this down into 2 pieces. The countries with high import rates are in a more vulnerable position, right? They're more vulnerable to global price surges of food products. They're more vulnerable to pandemics, climate shocks. Their food security is in jeopardy, right? And they are probably interested in things like land efficiency if they have very little arable land within their borders. So they might be more open to arguments for food security, food sovereignty, economics, right? They're in a vulnerable position, and I'm sure they'd be very happy to find a way out of that vulnerable position. So it's a good framing if you're considering policy initiatives in those countries. But countries with high export rates are, of course, going to have an opposite context. These countries are probably going to be much harder to convince because the animal agriculture industries are cash flow for them, right? Those countries represent employment, GDP, like they want their export revenue, right? So it's not to say that these countries cannot be convinced, but you're gonna have to take a different approach. You're gonna have to talk about maybe, human edible crops and alternative proteins as an even greater economic opportunity. Because again, they're not in a vulnerable position. They're quite happy to keep making money with what they're already doing. So to talk you through what I'm actually showing you here so you can interpret this, if you haven't caught on already, in the lighter shades, you are going to see the greatest importers of a given product, and in the darker shades, you're going to see the highest exporters of those products. So when we look at pork in pink, you can see that China is the top pork importer, and then Spain narrowly beats the US as the top exporter. And when we look at dairy, China is the #1 dairy importer, interestingly, despite widespread lactose intolerance, and New Zealand is the #1 exporter. And I think I skipped over actually one of them, so I'm going to show you really fast. When we look at poultry, Senegal is the greatest poultry importer, and then Thailand is the #1 exporter by a wide margin. And when we look to the next one, China imports more beef than the following 8 highest importers combined, and then Brazil is the top exporter, which I don't think comes as much of a surprise to most people if you're aware of how strong JBS is as the top meat producer in the world. Okay, I promise we're wrapping it up, guys. So I walked you through a whole bunch of things to keep in mind when it comes to your initiatives, whether it's the dietary rates that Alex was talking about, whether it's trade dynamics that I was talking about, whether it's a whole litany of alternative protein companies and restaurants to keep in mind. There's a couple things we haven't touched on yet, and I think you really ought to come away with them. One of them has to do with the language of veganism. So The way vegan is translated across the world really does matter. The vocabulary of vegan is crucial, for everything from ordering at a restaurant to discussing animal rights. We need to have a common language here, so we best know what that language is. So what we found is that many languages don't have their own terms for vegan. They've simply adopted the terminology of vegan into their own language, sometimes with keeping to the norms of that language. So, for example, in Spanish, they're not saying vegan, but they are saying vegano or vegana. So, quite close. I think we can track the distance there. But that's not always the case. So other countries do have their own unique terminology for this concept of veganism. For example, in China, arguably the most common translation, of course there's a lot of regional variation here, but arguably the most common translation will translate to pure vegetarian or pure vegetalist. And that's important because this character, pure, is going to distinguish it from vegetarian. But sometimes this term vegetarian is used for both vegan and vegetarian, so keep your eye out if you're traveling. If you already live there, I'm sure you know this. But if you're out traveling, be aware, because you might accidentally be consuming animal products if Google Translate leads you astray. But that's not the only terminology that you're going to look for. Something that I found quite interesting is that in China, you're also going to see translations for things like pure Buddhist vegetarian or pure Buddhist vegan. Now, this clearly predates the vegan society's terminology of vegan from only 80 years ago, and it also holds religious connotations that you're not going to encounter elsewhere in the West. So, for example, what are these connotations? A pure Buddhist vegan isn't just abstaining from animal products, they're also going to abstain from alcohol or the 5 pungent spices. So there's some differences regionally on what these 5 pungent spices are, but most often you're going to see that these include garlic, onions, chives, leeks, and scallions. So if you really love those foods, I'm so sorry, but you aren't going to have them in your cuisine if you go to restaurants that have, those options. And finally, I'm just going to talk about some of our Google search trends data. So essentially, look beyond the hype. I guess I'm going to serve you guys some nuance here. Search terms related to veganism peaked around 2020, and they've since fallen off a bit. We're seeing a downward curve of explicit interest in the topic of veganism via Google. But that's not really telling the full story. So for example, I'm going to tell you guys about Denmark, which most people may already be aware of their plant-based action plan. So this is a huge, sweeping, nationwide initiative, the first of its kind, the first government to ever do such a thing. And this impacts everything from the farm to the fork, as they say. But Denmark doesn't, in their plant-based action plan, they don't use the term vegetarian or vegan ever. They explicitly avoid any mention of these terms because they could be polarizing, right? So this shows that, okay, maybe explicit interest in veganism could be waning, but that doesn't mean that the undercurrent, the infrastructure for veganism is falling off. In fact, it could be growing. So that's something to keep in mind, that this stuff might actually even be by design. So maybe don't be too discouraged if you see interest in veganism starts to drop. And I think Alex told me the other day he looked at the search trends again, and some places are starting to shoot up again. So I guess the data's already outdated. I don't know, Google it yourself, googlesearchtrends.com. And that brings us to the end. There's the QR code. Please do check out the report. And I think Alex has some closing words as well.
Yeah, thank you very much, Elise. So obviously this is like we said at the beginning, a snapshot of quite a lengthy, detailed report. This isn't going to capture the full scope of everything that we've done in this work, and obviously, we've gone to lengths to talk to vegan and animal advocates in different countries that we've talked about, but there are going to be kind of cultural or political blind spots that we have in different countries. So this work, as detailed as it is, it's not the end point, really. There's always going to be more to learn, and there's always going to be more opportunities to do different research in different countries. So if you've listened to our talk and you think, actually, you've missed something really important about this specific country, we want to hear about it, because that's only going to improve the research that we do, and we want this kind of veganism around the world research to be quite as collaborative as possible. So if you do have any remarks or any questions or anything you want to feed back to us about this research, either from the talk or from actually reading the report, please get in touch with us at research@vegansociety.com. And yeah, please check out the report. Thank you.